how come you wouldn't expect it to happen at our big fleet base? And part of it was a belief that it was too shallow for torpedoes, but Taranto's pretty shallow too. In fact, the British lost torpedoes in the mud. So it might be more, why didn't we get the message, rather than did the Japanese get inspired?
On December 7th, 1941, a year after the British carrier raid on Taranto, the Japanese Imperial Fleet showed the rest of the world the devastating firepower of the carrier strike force. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 6 carriers caught the U.S. Pacific Fleet totally unprepared. Pearl Harbor was to be a milestone in the evolution of carrier warfare. The Japanese called it X-Day, and it marked the beginning of the end of the battleship era.
Pearl Harbor had destroyed the American battle fleet as a traditional fleet of battleships. All the Americans had left were their aircraft carriers. This meant that if they were going to strike back at any further Japanese thrust, they had to do it with their aircraft carriers. And this led the way into the first battles in which ships fight each other out of sight, using the aircraft as their primary striking system.
If you think of what carriers do, the leverage is mobility. You can show up anywhere. Jeez. All of a sudden, they showed up with Pearl Harbor. Okay, we didn't know they were coming. We show up with Tokyo. Ouch!
The United States aircraft carrier Hornet, part of a task force steaming into Japanese waters, is now revealed as the secret base from which American planes first bombed Tokyo.
The Americans had mounted from their Navy aircraft carriers U.S. Army Air Force aircraft. These aircraft were led by a famous American pilot, Jimmy Doolittle, and hence it is known as the Doolittle Raid, but in fact it did a great deal.
The raid was launched on April 18th, 1942, 700 miles from the coast of Japan. This was beyond the range of the Navy bombers, so Army B-25s were brought on board for the strike. The raid clearly proved a carrier could project power far beyond its horizon. And although the bombing was of little tactical value, its emotional impact was huge. The first bombing of the Japanese mainland.
This was a tremendous shock to the Japanese, a tremendous cultural shock. They were so angry, they cut the heads off the pilots, the ones they captured. And this led the Japanese into thinking the US carrier fleet is our major threat. This meant that they would have to go after the American fleet, and this tipped the balance into a major operation against the islands of Midway, not so much to capture the islands themselves, but to draw out the remnants of the American fleet, the carriers in particular, and sink them. And it all went dreadfully wrong.
Midway lies directly between Japan and Hawaii. Admiral Yamamoto planned to invade Midway, knowing that his adversary, Admiral Chester Nimitz, would be unable to tolerate a Japanese base so uncomfortably close to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz would have to rush his carriers to Midway, and there Yamamoto would annihilate them.
Unless they kill the U.S. carriers, they can't be free. So the U.S. knows this, but we're interested in killing their carriers, because if we do that, we can operate much more freely. So we find out in advance where the Japanese are going to attack. We do that by code breaking, and we're ready for them.
The Americans had sent extra aircraft to Midway in preparation for the impending Japanese invasion. Just after sunrise, on June 4th, 1942, Marine pilots took off. The battle was about to begin. Its outcome would alter the course of the war in the Pacific. World War II carrier helmsman Floyd Moss.
We picked up a communication of the Japanese that they were going to capture Midway and use it for a base. And Nimitz had broken the Japanese code at that time and understood they were coming in, and they were going to come in, sneak in from the north and hit Midway. But we caught their planes on deck, fueled with bombs on them.
A sea-level attack by U.S. torpedo planes drew the Japanese Zero fighters down from patrol, high above their carriers. The Zeros slaughtered the two torpedo squadrons, but their sacrifice was not to be in vain. High above, two squadrons of dauntless dive bombers from the USS Yorktown and two from the USS Enterprise advanced upon the Japanese, unnoticed by the distracted Zeros. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, their decks packed with refueling aircraft and munitions. 10:22 a.m., June 4th, 1942. It was a decisive moment. 6 minutes later, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were wrapped in flames and erupting with repeated explosions. The final toll was 4 Japanese carriers lost to 1 American. Midway was Japan's first defeat at sea in 350 years, and the turning point of the war in the Pacific.
Once the battle began, carriers were vulnerable. They didn't have armored flight decks in the Japanese Navy or the United States Navy. They were full of aviation gas, high-octane aviation gas, which is very volatile. They carried a lot of ammunition, bombs, and torpedoes for the strike aircraft that they had. And so they were floating volcanoes, and it was understood that the carrier that could get in the first strike, or the carrier force that could attack the other first, would probably destroy the other. And in fact, it might be possible for one force to completely eliminate the other at the opening stage of a battle.
Midway proved that first strike was vital in carrier-based sea warfare, and a new technology was about to give the Allies a further advantage in the sea battles of World War II: radar.
The radio waves pass through clouds or darkness, and by their echoes can locate airplanes hidden from sight.
Radar is still a key advanced warning system for the modern fleet, giving the carrier an instant picture of aircraft and ships in its vicinity. The technology came into its own in the latter years of the Pacific War.
If you go 2 years after Midway, there's a battle called the Philippine Sea. At this time, the Japanese have very painfully rebuilt their carrier force. We have a much larger carrier force ourselves, thanks to our production in the United States. The Japanese still have very long-range aircraft, longer range than ours, incidentally. They find us first. By pre-war rules, if you find the other fellow first, it's over. He can't defend himself very well. His carriers get blown up. That's what happened at Midway. But by this time, we know how to use radar. So as their attack comes across, we kill it. In fact, it's such a disaster, we call it the turkey shoot. The turkey's not being very good at avoiding being shot. We don't sink most of the carriers. We destroy the aircraft in the air. That's a triumph of radar and very good fighter control.
The Japanese nemesis on June 19, 1944, during the turkey shoot, was Lieutenant Alexander Verashiu, a Hellcat pilot. By shooting down 6 Japanese planes in a single sortie, he became